I'm here with Scott Johnson, who's the rehabilitation, strength, and conditioning coach for the Parramatta Eels, which for our North American audience is a professional rugby league team based in Australia. So that's the highest level of professional rugby in Australia. Scott has a master's degree in strength and conditioning and also in rehabilitation. And he's got a ton of experience working with athletes at the highest level. So it's a real privilege to have you, and I really appreciate getting your insights. So thanks for being with me today.
No problem at all, Les. Thanks for having me on, and looking forward to having a bit of a chat. It's a very interesting area, looking forward to having a chat over the next little time.
Yeah, great. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about your background in strength and conditioning and rehabilitation and some of the work that you do currently.
Yeah, so I suppose my background is fairly classic. So I did an undergraduate degree in sports science and human movement, which still has a fairly high component of exercise rehab and obviously sport and injury rehab as well. From there, did my postgraduate degree in strength and conditioning and rehab, and then from there, I suppose, went to the practical field. So, as we know, lucky enough to start off at a very low level with a sporting team, with a rugby league team, and I was able to work a bit of a dual role with both our developmental athletes and also the top athletes and the full-time athletes as well. So from there, I was able to see how, I suppose, how the elite athlete worked, and the elite coaches and physiotherapists and doctors were working with the top athletes, and then I suppose trying to apply that to the younger athletes and developmental athletes, which is a great learning curve, both in a theoretical and a practical sense as well. Mm-hmm. The role at Parramatta came up at the end of last year, which was a good opportunity in more of a rehab space rather than, I suppose, a classical strength conditioning, which I've been in and out of rugby union, rugby league for the last 5 to 6 years. It was a good little challenge, made my brain think a little bit differently, but still the end goal of trying to get these athletes back in the best shape from a strength and conditioning coach purpose as can be. So I'm not a physiotherapist or a physical therapist. I don't. They're brilliant at their work, but I suppose my role is to get them to make sure that from a strength conditioning I suppose point of view, that they're going back into the program or back to the field or whatever in the best shape they can be.
Sure, and of course, in a sport like rugby league, strength conditioning, I imagine, are critically important to performance.
Yeah, definitely. Especially in most collision-based sports, there's a huge toll on the body. So we've got to make sure that they can get back and that they're going to be preparing their body both for the contact, but there's also a high load of running in our sport as well. So both from a endurance and also a high speed running point of view as well. So we've got to make sure that all those areas are ticked off before we can throw them back into either training or a game. So a few different areas that we need to go through.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that point a little bit later about some of the areas that need to be addressed before the athletes come back and kind of ticked off. Maybe you can talk about some of the common types of injuries in rugby league.
Yeah, so being a contact sport, we have a lot of contact injuries, and I suppose with American football as well, a lot of shoulders, a lot of shoulder injuries, a lot of upper limb injury just because of the sheer nature of having to tackle. But normal injuries that occur with a lot of team sports, so lower limb injuries, ankles, knees. I suppose we try to pride ourselves on limiting the soft tissue injuries as well, especially I suppose that are done around our hamstring, calves, and I suppose lower limb especially. But there's some things that we can't prevent, whether it's a broken nose or a broken collarbone. Sometimes you can't prevent them. It's a collision-based sport. And, we've got to make sure that I suppose we can do as much as we can to prevent I suppose, the preventable injuries happening as best we can.
Sure. Yeah, again, kind of given the nature of the sport, there's bound to be a certain number of injuries through collision or those kinds of things. What are some of the challenges that an athlete experiences? And it could be physically, it could be psychologically once they do get injured.
I think from two sides, like I said, I suppose touching on the physical side, the challenge is, I suppose, trying to get them back to where they are. So if they had making sure that they can physically do what they're able to do to get back on the field. So I suppose it's a little bit of they do cross over the physical and mental side of things. So from a physical side, obviously there's going to be some weaknesses around a certain area. There might be loss of range of motion, loss of muscle size physically happening there. But mentally, there's going to be a couple of things that they need to do in rehab that they need to progress. So whether that be they need to progress if they're coming back from a shoulder injury, we progress from we need to do some contact with them, because we don't want the first time that they tackle somebody to be at a very big, heavy player running full steam ahead of them. So they have to psychologically, I suppose, especially if it's happened in that sort of scenario, I suppose getting those mental challenges stage by stage. And obviously starting very small in a very controlled environment, and then coming up and increasing into a little bit more uncontrolled.
So it's important that the athlete feels psychologically prepared to be able to engage in, the key aspects of their performance. And as you say, that occurs in a very kind of progressive manner. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose it's also from a coach or a practitioner side, making sure that there's a strong communication between the athlete and the practitioner or coach, because there's we know I suppose what should happen or what could be happening, but we don't know really what's happening inside that athlete's body and how they're feeling that day. So I suppose we might talk about more of the mental side a little bit later, but there's a lot of things that we can control at the facility when they're there. There might be some stuff outside that's been happening, but also from I suppose an injury point of view, what are they feeling? I'm not ready to do any tackling yet. I need to it doesn't feel as strong yet. Or it can sometimes work the other way, where you got to hold athletes back, especially if they're getting pushed by a deadline of a big game coming up in a couple of weeks, or from a coach, or I suppose in the professional setting, their contract is up for renewal, or all of a sudden there's a huge amount of different factors that come into sometimes what can seem a very simple rehab.
Right. And so you mentioned kind of the time pressures, I guess, to get back. Is that sort of front and center in the athlete's mind as resuming play as quickly as possible?
Yeah, definitely. They all want to. Rehab is sometimes not the most fun place to be. You're usually, I suppose, away from the team for some part, and I suppose part of my role is to try to make sure that or I try to include them as much as in team activity as they can, because we're in a team-based sport. So being away from the main team can be, I suppose, psychologically a little bit. It can take a little bit of a toll on the athlete there as well. They're doing a different program. They might have to do more work than the rest of the team sometimes to get back in. They might do longer hours. So yeah, we need to make sure that I suppose they're all coming. That it's a little bit of exclusiveness or inclusiveness within the athletes program, definitely. But from a time frame point of view, that can be, I suppose, a lot of external factors there as well. There might be a coach who needs his star player back earlier because, again, a big game, or like I said, from a monetary point of view, there's a contract renewal or other things there as well.
Right. So how are sort of those external maybe factors in terms of contracts or the coach needing an athlete to be ready for a certain game or competition. To what extent is that balanced with the progressions, the functional progressions that you mentioned a minute ago?
Yeah, I suppose it's all part of this is the part that makes the rehab process quite interesting. Is it's so it's a lot of different aspects that I suppose you don't really realise when somebody does or somebody rolls their ankle or does a hamstring strain. You see it's a fairly straightforward process, but you throw in the time of year that they're doing it at. It sort of sets the cat among pigeons a little bit. I suppose the way to sort of get everything, I suppose, in as much control as you can be is to make sure that, I suppose, everybody's on the same page. And our coach is very good. If, of course, coaches want their potential, we'll call it, their star player back earlier. But if we educate the coach on that, if we bring him back earlier, then it might be longer in the long term. Then I suppose they're more accepting of that, to take an extra week now rather than another 4 weeks later on. Right. That's probably going to be a better approach. And it's about educating everybody as well, and getting everybody on the same page. So even from the strength and conditioning staff to the medical staff to the doctors to the coaching staff, that everybody's, I suppose, educated and on the same page of this is a 4-week injury. We'll do really well to get them back into 4, but we'll do our best. If we try to push too hard here, it's going to end up being an 8 or 9 week injury. I know we try to get them back as soon as we can, but that's the reality of the injury.
Right. So I just want to touch on 2 points that you mentioned. One was communication, and the other, this issue of education. And in terms of education, maybe you can elaborate on the value or importance of educating athletes about the nature of their injury.
Yeah, it's pretty important. So especially when the athlete's feeling good, and they're like, I can go out and do this now. I can get out there, and why aren't I playing? It's educating the athlete on what actually is involved in their injury and what they have to do in a game, or what, I suppose, the steps are to get back to that scenario. So it's an education from I suppose the newer generation. They like to, I suppose, have a lot of information there as well. So education from not only the injury standpoint, but also the rehab process as well. Finding a lot of younger athletes like to know not only, I suppose, what we're doing today on Friday or on Tuesday, but in 4 weeks' time, what are we trying to progress? If we're running a certain volume today, what are we doing the next day, and then how has that progressed? And I suppose it's also good from an educational. It educates the athlete, but then I suppose from a coaching point of view, making sure that it's not, they might say, oh, what about we try to do this here? Or there might be something coming up in their life that you might have to adjust. I'm going to go to see my family that day, or it's my birthday or mum's birthday, whatever it is that day. So it's educating, I suppose, both all parties involved there is going to be pretty important.
Right. And again, it's not just the athlete that can benefit from the education, but also you mentioned the coaches that maybe need or benefit from information about, well, if we bring the athlete back at this point, then potentially there's detrimental consequences, or
definitely
giving them that kind of information to inform the decisions.
Definitely. And also from I suppose, a coach point of view, sorry, just to add on that if it's a recurrent injury as well, and an older athlete, I suppose you can tap into see what worked or what didn't work in their last rehab, and you can sort of change that as well. So it's educating from both sides there as well.
Right. And again, just in terms of the athlete, when you said younger athletes in particular want a knowledge of what's happened and maybe information on like why they're doing something, how is that beneficial, or what implications does that have, maybe in terms of their behaviors or their progression in rehabilitation?
I suppose they can, I see mostly as a positive. The athletes can see how much, I suppose, in both from a work point of view, they can see how in-depth the rehab process can be. and they can buy in that way. And they can also see if they're in that situation of feeling good, then you can also refer back to the plan. And that's sort of also saying that rehab plans can sometimes you write a rehab plan for 4 or 6 weeks, and in the first week it's totally thrown out, or it's a fairly fluid moving program most of the time.
Right.
And it gives the athletes need to, I suppose, know that as well. But from an education standpoint, it's hugely important that they're across everything, and they know, I suppose, the steps there rather than just turning up every day and being quite robotic. I suppose it adds a little bit of buy-in there as well from the athletes, that they know they have to. We're doing this particular drill this day to help with that particular drill in 2 days' time or in 3 days' time.
And why would you say the buy-in is important?
Because it's hugely important, because the athlete is still then looking after themselves for most part of the day. We can have them at the facility for 10, 12 hours a day, but for the other 12 hours a day, they're there by themselves. We're facilitating, we're not babysitting at the same time. So we can give them all the tools to make sure that they're doing everything from a recovery standpoint, from a nutrition standpoint. They're getting their bodies away from the facility in the best shape they can be, because we'll put the best program in front of them, put them through the best program they can be when they are at the facility.
Right. So you mentioned, you phrased it, you're not babysitting the athletes. Is it important for the athlete to know that the onus of, or the responsibility for their recovery lies primarily with them, or?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And it sort of gives them a bit of in this sort of space, you're working with athletes from 18 to, what I'm working with, 18 to 36. So they're essentially young men to fathers to grown men. So, and that's, I suppose, a little bit the art of it as well. You might give a little bit more, you might have to, I suppose, not babysit, but be across a little bit more of the 18, 19-year-old recovery process. But the 35-year-old, you might give a little bit more, give a little more grace to. What do you think? What's worked well for you? But yeah, we're still not there to babysit the 18 or 19-year-old. We're not there to, make sure they have the right breakfast, or that they do their 5 or 6 minute ice bath or whatever it is, or they sit on this recovery tool for 12 minutes. It's still their body. And I suppose they also, it's an education, going back to the education part. If you sort of keep spoon feeding these 18, 19-year-olds, then they're not going to get any better in the long term anyway. They need to know, they need to work out, as we all do from experience, that this is what I need to do, rather than just being told.
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting point. They need to work out what they need to do. And, despite all the support and information you might be giving them and the resources they have access to, that they still have to kind of engage to the best of their ability, and it's their recovery.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
In terms of that point about about communication, you had mentioned, that it sounds like it's important to get feedback from the athlete, or have the athlete indicate to you what they're experiencing, how they're responding to treatment. Maybe you can speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I suppose we need to make sure that we know how, I suppose, it's giving feedback from us on how our program's going, and how the athlete's feeling. Because, like I said, rehab is, you might have a very structured program coming up, and all of a sudden something may go positive or negatively. A drill you might do, or a strength exercise might not go as planned, and you need to readjust things. So communication is very important, because otherwise you're just going to go off the plan, and it's going to be probably more detrimental than good. That can be, you also want the communication to work both ways. Going back to a scenario where the athlete's feeling quite good and they're what they perceive ahead of schedule, you need to communicate to them that they might need to just put the brakes on a little bit. They are going very, very well in this scenario, but we just want to make sure that we're not doing too much, I suppose, too soon, even though they subjectively feel quite well.
Right. So is there that tendency for athletes to want to push ahead and kind of get back as quick as possible?
Yeah, definitely. I suppose those other factors we talked about earlier come into it as well. But also, I think nobody wants to be injured from a general population side of things. They want to be you want to be able to run around with the dog at the park. You want to be able to walk to get the morning paper without any pain. So if you take that to an elite level, they want to be able to be fairly high tuned athletes. They want to be out there on the field rather than sitting from the stands. So that's what I suppose they chose their profession to be. So they don't want to be in the gym or away from the main group or sitting in the stands on game day.
Sure. You talked about the need to make readjustments, Scott, and
Yeah.
When there's, depending on how the athlete responds, and how do athletes, and maybe it's hard to generalize, but in your observations, do you see differences maybe in terms of how athletes respond to the need for adaptations to the program? Or perhaps
Yeah,
you say, well, like, I know we said this is typically a 7-week recovery, but based on your response, your knee is still swollen, so we got to modify.
yeah.
How do athletes adapt to some of those changes in the program?
Yeah, that's where communication comes back into it as well. So making sure that you're, I suppose, communicating to the athlete that these changes are happening and we can sort of bring this forward and might have to push something back. So if we've done an exercise in the gym or if we try to progress something, and for that example, if their knees become swollen or something's happened, we might need to change the goalpost. And that happens all the time. You need to, especially in this sort of environment, you need to, I suppose, push the ladder or, go pretty close to the line to be able to progress, because most of the time when these athletes are getting paid a lot of money, for the difference between a 4 and 6 week injury is fairly large.
Right.
But you want to sort of push as close to the line as you can without sort of going over, and then sometimes that has detrimental effects. But as long as, and this is where you come back to communication with the athlete and everybody involved, that we're going to try this on this day, and the athlete knows that as well. The athlete's comfortable with it. Sometimes the body does things that you don't expect it to, and it might push something back. But on the other side, some athletes are quite good healers and can progress things quite quickly. They do things that, I suppose, on paper they shouldn't be able to do, and all of a sudden they're one step ahead. They sort of skip a stage. So again, communicating that to them, and then them communicating that to you.
Yeah. You mentioned that idea of kind of walking the line or pushing the envelope. Is that a challenge for someone in your role to know how much to push, when to hold back?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a little bit of the art of, I suppose, the art of the side of it as well, rather than the, I suppose, the physical programming. That some days we need to do some high-speed running. It just has to happen. And if you're coming back from a hamstring injury, that's always a little bit of a risk. But try to make it as controlled as you can. Eliminate all, I suppose, all the external factors that they might reach in a game. But yeah, we want to sort of keep progressing as we do with the normal strength and conditioning program, that progressive overload. We want to make sure that that in the rehab process as well, that they're progressively getting better. And in season, sometimes that can be a little bit more of a need with between games or a big game coming up or something like that.
Mm-hmm. What are some uncertainties or worries that athletes might have who are injured or as they progress in their recovery?
Yeah, I suppose the uncertainty is are they going to be able to come back in the same shape, or are they going to be able to come back with the same strength? And uncertainties around that, I suppose, their own ability there as well. So I suppose something we haven't really talked about too much is that as a rehab, in the rehab role, you need to know the sport quite well as well. So not only from an injury standpoint, from an injured knee or ankle, you need to know their role within the game. So the first time in this sense that they're catching a ball is not the first day back at training or in the game. You need to include that in that rehab process, because that's their role. They're not a track and field athlete that I work with, so their primary role is not to run. Running is a huge impact, so they need to be able to catch, they need to be able to get up and down off the ground, they need to be doing a huge amount of things. So psychologically, making sure that they get those things ticked off along the process there as well, so that when they get to their first training session or their first game, they've done things in a somewhat of a controlled environment, or they've done things multiple times, right. So that you can alleviate those potential concerns.
Right. So the fact that they've done the skills that they need to, well before, in advance of their actual return to play, it sounds like that has benefits for their confidence or their kind of readiness.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so there's you need to put them in almost like game-like situations, and then sometimes you need to be a little bit more comfortable and actually do it at their mechanism of injury as well. Especially if it's a typical scenario within a game. So whether that would be reaching out to score a try and dislocate their shoulder, or they tackled in a different from side on, and might have an MCL injury that starts out from there, then you still need to tick that off. And it's also, I suppose, a way that we test to see how our rehab process has gone as well, from both a physical standpoint from the injured side, but also a psychological, like you said, where the athlete will be able to go through that without any issues. And from a psychological standpoint, I suppose from a performance standpoint, if they're not ready to do that, then their performance is going to obviously decrease, and then I suppose they're open to injuries in other areas as well.
Yeah. And in terms of your work as a practitioner, you mentioned the importance of being able to understand the specifics of that player's role and the tasks that they perform in that in their role or their position, to be able to integrate those skills into their recovery. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I suppose I could even flip it over to a bit of an American standpoint. So if you were, because I still watch a lot of American sports. I love NBA when the sport's on around the world. But rehabbing a quarterback's injury versus a wide receiver's injury is going to be completely different. They might have the same injury. They might have both done a medial collateral ligament in their knee, but completely different athletes, and their roles and demands within the game is going to be completely different. Yeah. Flipping that back to a rugby league standpoint, from a front row forward doing their we'll call it, stick on that MCL, the MCL injury, versus a fullback, who's completely different roles. So you need to not only take the injury into standpoint, but also, I suppose, the athlete and their role within the team, the position they play.
Right. And you also mentioned, Scott, that there can be detrimental consequences if the athlete is not psychologically ready. What might be some of those implications?
Well, going into things, I suppose, with a different, not only mindset physically, but also mentally. So if the athlete is not ready, we play collision-based sport. So if they're coming back from a shoulder injury or a knee injury and they're not ready to tackle yet, then I suppose their technique might be slightly off. If their technique's slightly off, then that's where they open themselves up to other injuries there as well. So not only from the injury that we're trying to rehab or have been rehabbing, then other things get opened up as well. So they're not using, they're trying to compensate essentially.
So on that note, are there observable signs or indicators for you as a strength and conditioning and rehabilitation specialist that indicate that the athlete may not be psychologically prepared to do the things that they're needing to do?
Yeah, and I suppose this again comes down a little bit to the art of it. So you can do, there's obviously, I suppose, some objective markers you can do around some questionnaires and all that sort of stuff. But usually if you're, this goes back to the communication side of things, if you're asking the athlete, are you ready to do this, or they do something quite hesitantly, you know yourself, if somebody is not doing something properly, if they're not running properly, or if they're favouring one side, it's a discussion point there as well. So both from a communication from you and the athlete, but also what you can sort of see physically there as well. If they're recovering from a lower limb injury, then their running gait is slightly off. An upper limb injury, they might be doing a chin up or a bench press or whatever, go back to the gym, and their technique's still slightly off, or if they're favouring one side, then those are some of the signs you can tell, and that's again a discussion point you go back to the athlete with.
Right. So those kind of movement pattern indicators then can be used to have some conversations with the athlete about what they're experiencing, maybe whether they're apprehensive or ambivalent about
definitely.
certain things. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. And again, that goes back to making the rehab, that might change slightly your rehab structure. You might have to be creative in a couple of different ways, but rehab is very making sure that it's having a structure there, but communicating and potentially changing that on the run as well.
Right. You've talked a lot about the importance of communication, and also, getting feedback from the athletes and having conversations. I wonder on a broader level about the sort of culture of rugby, and I know, in a lot of contact sports, maybe there's this tendency to, want to push through challenges, or to not necessarily indicate that one is in pain, or and so are athletes, are they willing to communicate when they're experiencing pain or difficulty, physically or psychologically, or are there challenges surrounding doing that?
No, there's definitely challenges. There's some athletes who are even, I suppose, within the not the rehab process, there can be an over-reporter or an under-reporter of their injuries. So they might come in and they say, "I picked my toe this morning. I might got a sore toe." You don't really need to know that, but they like to report it. Where some guys will come in and won't tell you about anything. And I suppose getting to know the athlete from that standpoint is pretty important, because they might not tell you how they want to get back for that big game coming up, or they'll hide that from you. And I suppose that's a little bit of the art of, I suppose, what you observe there as a coach, making sure that what you see there might be slightly off, or and making sure that, I suppose, potentially have a lot of objective markers there, so you take the subjective side out of it from the athlete.
Right, and so is maybe some of the underreporting a consequence of worry about the implications of doing so?
Potentially, yeah. And also sometimes it's just the athlete's makeup there as well. Like you said, it's most of collision-based, well, all the collision-based athletes are pretty tough athletes. They run into people for a living, so they're going to have to put up through pain in a game. So especially in those different positions there as well. So they need to be able to, I suppose, mask pain a little bit, and then that can be a good thing and a bad thing at the same time.
Yeah, and I want to touch more on that point about pain, because I imagine, especially for a contact sport, it's part and parcel of the experience. Maybe you can talk about the types of pain, again, either physical or psychological, that athletes experience after injury.
Yeah, so I suppose the physical pain is fairly, I suppose, straightforward to the injured site. So if you've done your ankle, your knee, your shoulder, you're going to obviously have some physical pain around that place, that joint, that muscle, whatever. From a psychological standpoint, it can be, like we said earlier, those thoughts start to potentially come in, those negative thoughts start to potentially come back into the athlete's mind about why did it happen to me? All these negative thoughts. Oh no, it's a long rehab process. It's I'm not going to be away from the team. I won't be able to play in this big game. All these other areas. So from an athlete standpoint, I suppose there can be a lot of negative sides of things there, both physically, not being able to, I suppose, from a body parts point of view, but also from a mental standpoint there as well.
Yeah. So kind of a predominance of negative thoughts or emotions about everything from missing out to uncertainty about returning or the implications of the injury. What are there ways that an athlete can manage or cope with some of those negative thoughts or emotions?
Yeah, and and this is, I suppose, comes back to athlete themselves, where even us as general population or non-athletes, some of us like to share a lot, and some of us like to be quite introverted. So we need to, I suppose, make sure that we can build a relationship with the athlete to make sure that we're actually here to help them. If they do have any negative thoughts, that we're either there to help them if it's within our scope, or to, I suppose, help them in to see that, I suppose, the right professional there as well.
Right.
But some other ways there, making sure that we're there for them, and making sure that the process is it's going to be a positive process. But I suppose turning somewhat of a negative into a positive sometimes, as in potentially saying, "Oh, we've done an upper limb injury. We've got a great time to be able to move on some lower limb, some movement patterns, or something like that."
Right.
Or give them a few different activities to do away from the rehab process, whether it be coaching, get involved in the coaching side of things. They might be able to do some sort of qualification in that time if it's a long enough injury. So that's where the whole life is just not rehabbing an injury.
Yeah.
Making sure that, I suppose, their support system, if they do have a good support system, family and all that sort of stuff, is in check. But yeah, it's all of a sudden, like we said before, a little simple injury a short-term injury can also be a lot of contributing factors in there as well.
Yeah. So those are some great points you mentioned, Scott, in terms of just, the athlete knowing that there are people there to facilitate their process, or that, are interested in their well-being, helping them assume different roles maybe, or to cultivate other interests, it sounds like, or sort of to take up things that they are interested in, but maybe don't have the time normally to do. To sort of reframe the experience as an opportunity to address other components of their performance, or to work on other unaffected body parts. Those seem like great points. So in terms of I want to just talk a little bit about expectations, and what, I guess, broadly speaking, what role do athlete expectations play in their recovery?
They play a fair bit. They're obviously fairly high up, because especially if it's I suppose a short injury, or somewhat a low grade injury, then they say, "Oh, it'll just be a couple of weeks and we'll be back, and we're just going to tick a couple of boxes and away we go." So that goes back to, I suppose, the planning side of things. This is where it works quite well, is that get the athletes involved in you'll plan everything, but to get them, I suppose, in inverted commas, involved in it, so they know that they've done actually what they're feeling there is not, I suppose, subjectively, is on a scan or on an objective measurement device. It's actually not as good as they think it is. But expectations are, it's a positive and a negative. So expectations, they want to make sure that they get back quick enough, so they'll do everything in their power to get back quick enough. So from a recovery, what they can control from their diet, from their recovery standpoint, from doing all their rehab properly, to seeing the right people. They'll do everything. It can be both a positive and a negative. So I suppose you don't want to push that down too much, but I suppose you want to harness that in the right direction.
Right. Okay. So the expectations can be potentially detrimental if, as you say, they're not sort of harnessed in the appropriate way.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
And I guess, what does that look like in actual or concrete terms? Like, yeah.
So I suppose an example could be if an athlete is feeling they've done a hamstring or a calf strain, low-level hamstring or calf strain, they think they feel fine. They subjectively, they walk around the facility, they can jog, they can do all different types of things. They should be right to go in their mind. Now, we haven't done any high-speed running. We haven't done any anything that's going to expose that injured site to, I suppose, to what we need to do to get back into the to training or to the game. So that can change expectations. So from a real-world example, making sure that the athlete knows that although they might not be feeling anything there at a sub-level, that from a high level that they might be starting to feel something, and you need to educate. You can't run for the athlete. So if you prescribe a certain drill, whether it's a high-speed run through or whatever, that the athlete doesn't go. I suppose that they know that their limits there, and they don't get too excited because that can also be, you're not there to. The athletes they're not robots, so you can't program them to run at a certain speed. If you tell them to run, they're going to run, right? So you need to, I suppose, control it the best you can.
Yeah. So of course, it sounds like the expectation is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you want them to be excited and to expect sort of, good things can come and will happen and occur. But if they start to fall into the trap of, I feel really good, and therefore I expect, or I should be able to do X, Y, and Z, when really they're not there yet, then that can be problematic.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So it's trying to, I suppose, harness that expectation, that positive energy into the right areas. It's a good problem to have, but you just need to be able to harness that in the right areas.
Yeah. So my next question is somewhat related. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the role of motivation in injury recovery.
Yeah, so I suppose it goes back to, again, a point we talked about, I suppose, those external factors. So if there's a big game coming up, they're going to be motivated to come back. Or if if their spot is potentially being taken by somebody else, then there's motivation to come back. There's also, I suppose, internal motivation to get back as well, but there's also external factors there as well. That can be, motivation probably changes throughout the year. So if somebody gets an off-season surgery, or if they get injured through one of the last couple of games of the year and they miss the last couple of games, and then there's off-season, there's pre-season, motivation probably isn't too high there. So motivation plays a huge role, because like I said, if having a higher level of expectation and I suppose how the athletes managing themselves, if they're highly motivated, you can harness that in the areas that is important and they need to. Where low motivation can be the opposite, and you've still got to drag them out to be able to get, I suppose, to those different areas that you need them to be.
You mentioned different types of motivation, some more internal, where maybe they're coming back just because they love playing the game and they enjoy the sport. Others more external in nature. Maybe it's about a contract or sort of concerns about the spot on the team, or some of those kinds of things, or maybe more pressure based. Would you say some types of motivation are better or worse than others? In other words,
yeah. Sorry.
Oh, just like, does it really matter sort of why the athlete is coming back in terms of their recovery or the effectiveness of return to play?
In some ways, I don't think it matters. It matters to, trying to answer this. It doesn't matter too much. I think it varies so much from athlete to athlete. A motivated athlete, I suppose, wherever it's coming from, is is easier to work with.
Mm-hmm.
So from a coaching point of view, I suppose a little bit of a selfishness thing is there. I don't really. Obviously, you want it to be internally somewhat. I think most athletes are internally motivated some way, but those external ones can sort of be a little bit of a cherry on top, or they can be something that can just tip over into a little bit more of a positive mind frame. So, or it's a little bit more motivation. So from a coaching standpoint, there's somebody who comes in who's motivated every day, who's ready to go and has done everything. I suppose on the surface there, it doesn't really matter where that motivation is coming from, but
Right.
I'd assume that most of them have a high level of internal motivation there. But obviously, there's going to be little parts of external motivation that I suppose make up the total motivation there.
Right. So if you kind of think of the total motivation as sort of the sum of those different drivers or factors energizing them, you mentioned that for many athletes there's probably a high internal component, but I think you used the expression sort of those extra motivations, maybe the cherry on top. So they're kind of would you say additive? Like if you have the internal motivation plus you have a few external motivators, that's just gives you extra kind of incentive. Or
definitely. And I suppose it adds to and like we said about expectations, as long as that motivation is put in the right areas, you can sort of try to I suppose manipulate or put those motivation in the right areas, that you don't want them to come in after doing a fairly serious injury and be very motivated and to be trying to cut their rehab framework in half. But as long as that motivation is put into the right areas, I think it's definitely a good thing.
Right. You've talked a bit about this, but I want to ask explicitly, what are some of the different types of support that athletes need or that they benefit from during their recovery?
Yeah, so the obvious one is the physical side. So to the injured side, so they obviously need the support, whether it's as simply as, to use a better word, to support with a brace or crutches or something like that, but all the way actually just supporting the athlete on that injured site. So making sure that they are going through that injury process or that rehab process the best they can. The emotional side is, I suppose, a little bit different because there's going to be a huge amount of contributing factors there as well. So from a not only an injury, not only an injury standpoint, but there can be things outside, like we said before. I suppose those things around contract, even family side of things. They might have had a fight with their partner. Their kid might have kept them up all night. So we need to make sure that the support is there, that they can, I suppose, see us as a coach. But if they need to see somebody more professional, that we've got an avenue there to help them out.
Right. So that there's different opportunities, whether the athlete can speak to the coach or if they need to seek external support, that they know that that's available as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and at most clubs now, the well-being side of things is quite at large. So we have a well-being officer at most clubs. So they might feel more confident talking to me or talking to them about certain things, depending on the relationship with each person. And as long as they know that, as long as I suppose those emotional support systems are there and they know that they're there, then that's important as well.
Right. So just the knowledge of knowing that they can reach out to someone that they feel connected to is beneficial or is useful for their recovery.
Definitely, and it's a even little things like stresses, like if they're injured but they have to move house in the next week or something, how they're going to help their partner and their kids do that, and then that's going to weigh on their mind, or they've got another big payment coming up, or a birthday, or travel, or whatever. So I suppose it's within the coach's scope or within our scope as coaches, we can try to help, but I don't say to know everything, so or pretend to know everything. So there's more professional people out there in this space than I am.
Yeah.
So making sure that I suppose those avenues are met, and there's a way to get to them if need be.
Right. So, it sounds like certainly in a professional environment where there's resources that there, or is there, I guess, a team approach to specifically to address injury recovery and its challenges?
I think there's from a team support, yeah. So from I suppose a performance department approach, yeah. But then we take that individual on its merits there as well, because as we know, let's give an example, a well-motivated athlete who has a 6 to 8 week injury is going to be very different to a non-motivated athlete with that same time frame.
Right.
And then if there are other things in there, all those external factors, and we've sort of got to try to both manage them and manage the athlete there as well. So it's much physical as it is mental there as well. You obviously are rehabbing the injured side, but you're also, I suppose, managing everything in and around the athlete, because obviously that's going to be play a detrimental effect on the progression there of the physical. If the emotional and the mental side isn't there, then the physical side's going to obviously take a hit as well.
Yeah. Okay. So there's sort of an interplay between the physical and the emotional. Like if, as you mentioned, there's sort of stresses or sort of life factors that are coming to bear on their recovery, that may have an impact on their ability to rehabilitate.
Yeah, definitely. So if their mind's somewhere else, or not on, I suppose, the present job at hand, then yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Coming back to that point about motivation, I guess you mentioned motivated versus unmotivated athletes. And I wonder for, a fan, say, of NRL or rugby, like maybe from an outside or from a sort of, the person who's maybe just a fan, but not necessarily competing, I wonder if they'd be surprised and say, oh, well, aren't the professional athletes, aren't they all motivated to do their rehab?
Yeah, I think I'd say for the most part, I think they're all fairly internally motivated, and otherwise they wouldn't have got to the position that they are. I suppose the motivation might come from the external side, or I suppose history as well. So are they internally motivated to come back from their third big knee injury? Is they know sometimes knowing what's about to happen is also sometimes not the greatest thing either. And also, like I said before about the high speed running, but athletes are also human as well. Sometimes we come out of bed some days and just not motivated to go to work, even though we're doing potentially something that we love. Sometimes something doesn't work, or you're having a bad day, or whatever. So most of the time they're I'd say a high percentage are motivated, but I suppose recognizing that they're human as well. And some days you just sometimes turn up to work and it doesn't happen for you that day. So
yeah, well, I think that's certainly an important point to make and keep in mind. Of course, everyone, professional or not, or regardless of what one is paid, still has ups and downs and life that affects them.
definitely.
What are there any benefits to injury, or is it just entirely a negative experience?
No, I think it's you got to almost try to make it as positive as you can, and I suppose we've touched on a couple of those things around. If you've got an upper limb injury, then we can work on some movement mechanics, some agility mechanics, whatever they're. Some of the guys don't like to hear it, but you can work on your aerobic fitness there as well. You can usually run a lot. So that's sometimes a bit of a hard sell, but you can do that at the same time.
Yeah.
But again, you can use it as a bit of a time to go into those different areas like I talked about before, so education or coaching, or some time. They're probably going to have a little bit more free time around a couple of different areas, or in time of the week. So you can finish off that potential course that you've been waiting to do, or you can progress it a little bit quicker, or you can help the coaches on your position group, which may also help you in the long run as well to see where they're coming from and to understand their process. So I suppose being creative in that as well is also going to be pretty important. So making sure that it's not just a negative. It's almost making sure that the process is, I suppose, nobody wants to be in rehab, but let's try to make the best out of a bad situation.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions. Are there factors that you notice that distinguish athletes who seem to have a successful return to play after injury versus those who are unable to do so or fail to do so in some way?
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of contributing factors there as well, but I think going back to that communication and buy-in there as well, and also from not only the athlete, but also I suppose all parties involved. So an athlete's going to come back successfully if all the coaches, medical staff, performance staff are on the same page. It's a 4-week injury. We'll get them back then. If a coach tries to push in at let's say, we've lost 2 games in a row now, we need you back this week, that can potentially change things, and then that sort of sways the balance of I suppose potentially making that rehab unsuccessful. But also from the athlete as well. Like I said, we're not here to babysit them. So if they're not looking after themselves from a nutrition standpoint, or doing on the recovery process, or doing all their normal sort of rehab away from the facility, then that's going to be important as well. So usually, some buy-in and communication from all parties involved. Yeah. But then also, I suppose we've already touched on this a fair bit, but motivation as well. If the athlete is highly motivated to come back, then usually that's going to also help as well.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, it sounds like success is a multi-factor or multifactorial issue. Some of those factors are situational or maybe contextual in nature, like the timing and whether they have enough time to get back to the game, or whether they're thrown into a competition maybe in a bit of a rush, or some of them sounds like more individual specific or related to the athlete in question and things like their motivation or what they might bring to the recovery.
Definitely, and it's I suppose that's the interesting and the hard thing about rehab sometimes, is that even though it can be a fairly simple progression or plan on paper, all of a sudden all these different areas come in and make that simple 3 or 4 week program, make it a little bit more difficult. And they can change from day to day. And I suppose being able to work on the run is pretty important. Being fairly flexible is important from a coaching standpoint.
Yeah, well, and several times you've mentioned the art and science. And so I guess maybe on paper you're thinking about the science and your knowledge of the body and mechanics and strength and conditioning principles, but then all those sort of human factors play in. And I suppose that's where sort of your skill as a practitioner, I imagine, comes into play.
Definitely. Whether that's adjusting, like if they're adjusting the goalpost, they might have to do a high speed running day the next day, or next week, or you come to some compromise there. It's a little bit of the art of it as well.
Yeah. My last question for you, Scott, is if you were to give one piece of advice to injured athletes, what would it be?
A piece of advice would be to say that it's usually getting injured is part of being an athlete, unfortunately, whether that is from a broken pinky to a ACL. So unfortunately, especially in the sport that I work in, that injuries are part and parcel of the industry and part of the game. So taking that into, I suppose, in your thinking, that it's not, I suppose, your fault or anything, that it's not your fault that you got injured, that you need to, I suppose, take it as a part and parcel and see it as a part of the game, rather than just a real negative area, which most athletes are across there anyway. They're fairly attuned to the fact that they play contact sport, and if you run into people for a living, then usually something's got to give somewhere.
Right.
Then most athletes are aware of that. So making sure that they're not taking it so personal and being hard on themselves, essentially.
Yeah. So kind of accepting that injury is part of the game of rugby in particular, and as you say, not I like that point a lot about not being too hard on themselves, or which I imagine is not easy to do for many athletes who strive to achieve athletic competence and achieve at the highest level. So thanks so much for your great insights and sharing your experience. It's been great speaking to you.
No problem, mate. Yeah, thanks. It's been great to have a chat today, and hopefully we can do it again soon.
Yeah, that sounds great.